Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Niger Innis Presents the Trump Revolution, a part of the fastest growing social media platform, the TvAbraham network. Today, we are blessed with everything that's going on around our planet and the existential crisis of civilization. We are so pleased to have on today one of America's top intellectuals, Robert Lawrence Kuhn. He's as I said, a public intellectual and investment banker. He is also an author, television producer, columnist, and commentator, especially on topics related to China. Mr. Kuhn is the creator of the PBS series Closer to Truth, and he has been called one of the Western world's most prolific interpreters of Beijing policies. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us today.
Pleasure, Niger. It's good to see you. I appreciate the work that you have done and are doing, and I look forward to getting into it.
We're going to have some fun today. And even though I didn't warn you in advance, because we're going to spend most of our time talking about the Iran war and the Middle Eastern situation in general, but considering your particular expertise in all things China, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One very personal. How the heck did you become the Western world's most prolific interpreter of Beijing's policies?
Well, that's a great question, and if I had 24 hours, I'd give you the whole story. But let me try to give it to you in shorter than that.
Okay.
And I start by saying I did not have an intrinsic interest in China. That was not part of my academic or intellectual interests. Of course, I knew about China like everyone else, but I was focused in science and neuroscience, brain science, and then went into investment banking and focused on the big questions of humanity that unites all human beings. And I'm sure we'll talk about that, the existential questions, questions of human consciousness. Those were what drove me. But in the late 1980s, one of my mentors was very close to the Minister of Science in China at that time. And he asked to bring some investment bankers to help China in their first efforts at reform, who were science literate but also understood economics and investment banking. And so I and a couple of others were invited to go to China in the late 1980s. And I was, I've done that with different countries. I interested, we went, but when I got there, I was immediately intoxicated by the fervor at that time, because this was pre-Tiananmen Square, and so
Hmm.
a lot of political interest going on. And we had our conference. It had to do with entrepreneurship in science and how that would work. The science area in China at the time was the least reform structure. The reforms had started in the countryside and then went into the cities, industrial plants. But the science community still had, as I put it, in one organization, a university, a manufacturing company, a hospital, a kindergarten, and a mortuary were all part of the same system.
Oh my
And
God.
so it was the planned economy on steroids, and they wanted to break that up. So I was part of that initial thing. And it was very enjoyable, but I got caught up in the political interest. Then Tiananmen Square happened 6 months later or so after I was there for the first time. And I and everybody else were very upset. And I said, I'm never going back to China. Never. That's it. I mean, I had some interest now, but no. And then a year and a half later, I was chairing a conference on creativity at UCLA. And I had the idea to invite someone from the science ministries, a director general level, right below a vice minister, and he could represent the science industries of China in this understanding of how you get creativity in bureaucracies. And he came over, and we had a translator. He didn't speak English, And the first thing that happened is myself and a couple of other people attendees kind of surrounded him and started blaming him for Tiananmen Square because he was the only. This is 15 months later because he was the only official we'd ever seen. So we took our anger out on this poor guy who came all the way here to help. And then he made a comment that changed my life. He said, Robert, Dr. Kuhn, whatever he said, you're right about the problems in China, but the reason is more your fault. He pointed right at me, and not my fault, meaning himself. And what does that mean? I mean, we must have a bad translator here because I'm not even there. And he said, no, that's the point. You're not there, and all of the people like you have left, so that we who want to have reform and have to build a country are left alone. And we need your help. And I suddenly
Wow.
said, wow, you're right, I'm wrong. I'll come back. And that began a long odyssey, and it's a long story, but in the process, I became my first book was the first investment banking book published on the mainland in the Chinese language in the mid 1990s. And then afterwards, through some very strange circumstances, I had the opportunity to write the biography of the former president, Jiang Zemin. And I think you can see it up there, that red book in the corner is the
Yes, yes.
biography of
The appropriate color, red.
yeah, right. That's his biography of Jiang Zemin, and that got me very well known in China. The Chinese translation, which was censored, but it was the best-selling book in 2005. Through the
Wow.
process, I met President Xi Jinping, 2005, 2006, and built up very very deep relationships. And I've really treasured the opportunity that I've had in China. I've spent a great deal of time, for example, on their anti-poverty campaign. So, whereas anti-poverty was not something in my wheelhouse. I'm interested in hardcore neuroscience and physics and psychology and geopolitics. But I was asked in the early days to see how they were approaching the anti-poverty campaign, and I immersed myself and spent
And
several
by the way,
years.
let me just remind my audience that the rise of China economically and its booming middle class is something I think folk like you, Robert, called the Chinese miracle. And
Yeah.
it's really pleasant to know that you were a part of that endeavor.
Well, they were just a small part and an observer, but really got into particular parts of it. And it's a remarkable story. I mean, if you look at the overall, you're bringing something like 800 million people out of extreme poverty. And when I got involved, and that was just as the economic boom occurred, it's the rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
So, you didn't have to focus on anti-poverty because just increasing economic growth generally will bring everybody's income up, and that worked. But beginning around maybe 2010 or so, right before Xi Jinping took office, and when he took office, he really emphasized it, that there would be still about 100 million Chinese people, 100 million, who, no matter how great the economic growth of China would be, they would still remain in abject poverty because
Wow.
they lived in extreme mountainous areas with no roads.
So they were secluded and
They were
isolated from
secluded.
the booming economy.
Exactly. And Shanghai and Beijing and Qingdao and Nanjing, all these places could have enormous GDP per capita, but these still areas would be in abject poverty. Some of them were minorities, so they didn't speak the
Ah,
main language.
like the Uyghurs.
Yeah, Uyghur. China has about 55 different minorities, many different ones. So they'd all be left behind. You'd have this great gap. So Xi Jinping had the vision that he said for China to become what they called a moderately prosperous society, which was their goal, their 2020 goal. He said it wasn't good enough to get a GDP capita on average up to a certain level, but there can't be any Chinese citizens living in abject poverty. So this began a 8, 9 year intense campaign which
Oh,
was
oh, oh, Robert, almost like a Belt and Road Initiative precursor.
it was a Belt and Road Initiative for China domestically, and Xi Jinping made a comment which to me is striking. He said, "I have spent more time and energy on poverty alleviation than on anything else." Now that
Wow.
shocks people. I've never heard a leader of a country say that. I mean, you think, I spend more time on the economy, on the military, on
Right.
geopolitics, on whatever. No, he said, I spend it on poverty alleviation during that period of time. And he did. And whenever he'd visit something, he'd always go to an impoverished village. And in a top down society, an authoritarian government where the boss is really the boss, if he sets that example, all the officials have to do likewise. And they set rules that if an official didn't meet their numbers, they couldn't be promoted. It was a very tough program that they did. And nothing is perfect. There was a lot of corruption involved, but they exposed the corruption because with so much money flowing, there are
It's
people
bound to
who
be corruption anywhere in the world for that.
anywhere. But in that program there was a lot. But they determined how to stamp it out and how to get the correct numbers. And it's still a work in process. When they achieve the goal of everybody above the minimum poverty level by 2020, they now said, now Xi Jinping said we now have to have common prosperity. So by mid-century, which will be roughly the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China in 2049, that the standard of livings in the rural areas will be roughly the equivalent of urban areas, which is an enormous
That is an
undertaking.
enormous lift.
I mean, it's a it's a multi-decade type of thing, and it's very difficult, and won't be done perfectly. But it's a vision. Look, China has a lot of problems. I could spend the rest of the week talking about the
Hmm.
problems, but I think people in the West, it would be helpful to understand the great achievements that China has made for its own people, particularly its poor people. Again, I can go through a litany of a lot of things that I don't agree with in terms of China's policies. But in terms of its anti-poverty campaign and common prosperity, I think it's a good model. It's
I
not.
think it was actually a little bit more effective than Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty here in our country.
Yeah, look, the vision was good. John told the Great Society or whatever it was
Right,
called.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. And the vision is good. It's just more difficult to do. Look, every system has trade-offs. There's
Sure.
no perfect system. If God came down and told us exactly what to do, maybe we'd have a perfect system. But that hasn't happened. Not likely to happen. And so we always have trade-offs. There are
Sure,
trade-offs in each system.
sure,
And I always point that out. But one of the benefits in China is that policies that need long-term commitment can have long-term commitment, like anti-poverty, like what they call Great Western Development, which is basically rural areas, north-south water diversification projects in terms of water resources. So look, those are things that can work in China. Once again, we can talk a lot about the different problems from corruption to pollution to media censorship, a lot of issues. But understand that for the Chinese people, a large majority really support what they've done because of the focus on poverty and general equality in society.
Well,
So
Robert, part of China's rise, or the reason they had the resources to explore extraordinary poverty alleviation programs, is because of their trade with the West, in
sure,
particular with the United States,
absolutely,
which started, of course, was kicked off by Richard Nixon's brilliant endeavor. Some say now not so brilliant, but certainly back then it was thought as brilliant endeavor to quote open up China
yeah.
to the United States and to the West. Now, and that pretty much was the standard quo, to bring folk like you in and to help build bridges between China and the West. And that was pretty much the standard point of view until I would say, the early or mid 2000s when we became a bit more hostile and a bit dubious and a little bit alarmist about the rise of China and the national security threat that it poses to the United States and the West. Um, with that posture, and it's really just accelerated over the last 20, 25 years. With that posture is China's, forgive my lax communication, but is China's golden egg going to burst?
Look, there's been a lot of people who have said for a long time when China collapses, etc., and none of those prophecies have come true. Nonetheless, China has some very severe problems in terms of a property bubble that is continuing to affect the economy.
You've got buildings in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai, buildings, beautiful buildings that are completely unoccupied, right?
Yeah, not necessarily in Shanghai and Beijing, but in other cities. You have to understand the Chinese system is very much the provinces in China historically have been like independent countries.
Mm.
It sounds like they're like states in the U.S.,
Hmm.
but they actually have had in the past much more control because they were populations of between 50 and 100 million. I mean, these are like big European countries, each one of these
Yes.
provinces. And
So
the
they
people
had
who,
even more autonomy than our states here in the
yeah, they
United
do.
States.
They do. They do. And because of the top-down system in China, where the boss of a local area is like the
A
boss of
king.
a corporation
Yeah.
and absolutely like a king. They once had they had a slogan in the past saying, I'm the king here, the emperor is far away. I mean, and so each little fiefdom, and Xi Jinping and his administrations have worked to change that. So each province wanted to have their own companies and that they controlled their own auto company, air conditioner company, book publisher, whatever it is, under their control, because that means they own it. That meant you had 30 different companies, and there was no economies of scale, and there was no national market. It was very complicated. But it still has that because you have the one party system, and so you don't have any local elections at a high level. They do it at the very lowest level, but that's really not meaningful. And so you don't have that, and you don't have a free media, and so the local the local people are literally the little emperors and untouchable. In recent time, particularly under Xi Jinping, they have the Central Commission for Disciplinary Inspection, which has sought to to root out corruption. But in a one party system, that's very difficult because
Yes.
you always have the opportunity for corruption. A famous Chinese conservative once said, and this is my favorite quote. He said, "Here's the definition of corruption. It says when an official will, or when an entrepreneur will give an official a chicken in order to get a cow."
Wow.
That's the definition of corruption. This goes back,
This doesn't
30
sound
years.
like a fair trade there.
Yeah, no, I mean, but that is in the essence. The entrepreneur wants a cow of some policy, and so he can give a chicken on under the table to the and that's one chicken more than the official had, so he's in good shape. He's happy, and obviously we're using chicken and cow today's that's in that has been in millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars can flow
Sure,
in a
sure.
remarkable
And
way.
of
So
course, China is not the lone country in the world
no, of
that
course
has
not.
this particular problem.
No, of course,
Um,
of course.
but Robert, let me ask you, I suppose in these provinces and the way you have the autonomy of these local provinces vis-a-vis the center of the country or the national country, I guess it's like if you have a good governor, if you will, or good king or CEO, it works brilliantly. But if you've got a corrupt, incompetent
Right.
CEO, it's an
Right.
absolute nightmare.
Exactly, and it gets more complicated because sometimes the competent ones are also corrupt. So it's not one or the other. Sometimes they're both, and that
Right.
may be I don't know if that's the worst of all possible worlds. There's one famous academic in China says that if we stop corruption in the Western sense of corruption, said the whole system wouldn't work.
Wow.
And now Xi Jinping has changed that, and it's been traumatic. But he's determined to do that. For example, in the healthcare profession, I was once asked on BBC or someplace, is corruption a problem in healthcare? And I said, no, it's not a problem. And the host, I thought it was a problem. I said, no, you misunderstand. It's not a problem because corruption is the entire system. It's not a problem on top of the system.
It's
It
the
is
way
the
things
system.
flows.
It's
Yeah,
the way
yeah.
everything has a a price. You want to see the best liver surgeon, that'll cost you this. You want to see a second level, it'll cost you less. And everything in the system, in the military, corruption worked because people would sell promotions, and you sell
Wow.
it at a market price because if I'm the if you're the boss, we'll make you the boss, and you promote me. You're a general, and you promote me to a junior general, and you know that I know that once I'm a junior general, I'll be able to make a lot of money on the side with kickbacks from
And,
orders.
and, and give me my taste.
And you can charge up front for my getting that
Oh,
promotion
oh,
because
wow.
so you'll charge me, I'll make up a number, a million RMB. It can be a lot more than that. Because you know that I'll know that I'll pay you, but I'll be
So
able to
I get my money in advance
yeah,
even
exactly.
before you get a
Yeah,
chance to
yeah,
make
yeah.
those profits.
Right. But it's a market, and Xi Jinping has been working to undermine that. And again, that's another thing to his credit. One can criticize a lot of things, but anti I give credit to Xi Jinping in three main areas: one, anti-poverty; two, anti-corruption; three, anti-pollution. So those three areas, China
Well,
has made.
that's an amazing story. Let me get before we switch to the Middle East. One more thing on China. What is your prediction? Of course, none of us knows except God. What is your prediction about the Taiwan situation and crisis? Do you believe that this kind of cold war between mainland China and Taiwan is going to turn hot within the next 10 years?
So this is the ultimate question. I can't give you a yes or no on any question, but I can give you a lot of color on it so we can understand it better. Certainly, from Xi Jinping's point of view, Taiwan, in some sense, needs to become unified in some sense with the mainland. Originally, when Hong Kong, the deal with the British, when Hong Kong was turned back to China, they had this, Deng Xiaoping, former paramount leader, had the comment of one country, two systems. And that applied to
Yes.
Hong Kong. And the system worked very well. And it really was a separate system in terms of freedom of the press, in terms of access to information, in terms of rule of law, no dominance of the Communist Party or any party. Weren't elections, but the system worked. After the difficulties, 2019, the Umbrella Revolution, China had several red lines which were exceeded in terms of Hong Kong becoming not just a problem in itself, but potentially spilling over to the mainland. So they then passed a national security law to really change Hong Kong. So the concept of one country, two systems was at the very least undermined significantly. So that was going to be, would they have liked to apply the same thing to Taiwan? They did to Macau, which was much easier, to Taiwan, which was always going to be a challenge. But now that that has been undermined, the public opinion in Taiwan is, single digits for who would want to unify with China at this point.
I remember the protests in Hong Kong where the folk were waving American flags and singing the American national anthem. That was pretty dramatic, and I'm sure Xi Jinping was not very pleased about that endeavor.
Well, that has certainly changed, and people in Taiwan know that and see it, and so that reinforces their desire to be independent. um, Xi Jinping is not a radical risk taker. He would not do what Vladimir Putin did with Ukraine. I think he's a lot smarter than that. But he does want to have some resolution during his term of office, which will go on for quite a while now. It could take many forms. We just had an event where the leader of the Kuomintang, which was the original nationalist party in China, which fought with the communists and lost and went to Taiwan, and they were the bitterest of enemies, now are China's closest allies in
Wow.
Taiwan because the Kuomintang believes that Taiwan is part of China. They just think they should be the party,
They
not the
should be the
communist party.
boss.
Yeah, they should be the boss. So they agree on only one China, but they disagree on who should be the boss or elections or how that works. But from China's point of view, that's fine. That's better than the other folks who want Taiwan to be independent.
Right,
And
right.
so they're willing to deal with that. That says at
What
least
what
that
percentage of the Taiwanese population do you think is represented by this new
the
ally?
Kuomintang, it is a minority to be sure. That's why they lost elections. And the Kuomintang right now are ambiguous. They don't say we want to join China. That's not their policy. They would lose substantially if they said that. But they said in some ultimate future, they've said in the past that if China becomes democratic and there are elections in the far future, then the two can unite because
That's
then it would be
fascinating.
a situation. Xi Jinping and team are looking for some sort of a hybrid on that, so that there will be some sort of a union, but keeping them apart. But we're pretty far away from that, from some resolution. But I never believed that Xi Jinping set a date of 2027, supposedly this date when China would be ready to make a full invasion. He wanted the military to be strong, and he has worked hard to strengthen the military from increasing the number of nuclear weapons to a severe purge of senior military officers at the highest level in more than any time in Chinese history, I think, in terms of senior people, in order to clean up the corruption and make a strong military. So, my sense, to bluntly answer your question, I'm not evading it. I'm not trying to
No,
evade
no, no, no.
it.
As you said, you are giving color to the
Yeah, yeah,
question.
yeah. Is that Xi Jinping will not authorize an invasion unless he felt, and everybody felt, 99.9% sure of its immediate success. And that would only occur if there's some severe change in the U.S.'s posture. And people say, the Iran war could fit into that framework. I don't think so. There are short things. Doing a blockade of Taiwan would be an intermediary, a
Mm,
gray zone. Something like maybe the U.S. is doing starting today
right. In the Strait of
the
Hormuz.
Strait of Hormuz on the Iranian ports. That's a possibility, but I don't think that will be a significant thing. I think they want to work towards an integration. So as a result of this meeting between the Kuomintang chair lady and Xi Jinping, they had like 10, 12 agreements. Simple stuff like more student exchanges, helping the Taiwan offshore islands with some energy from Fujian province, which is right next right across a very short strait from them, and a whole bunch of straight of policies to integrate the two. So that's more their policy. The more they integrate, the more the Taiwan people can feel that they're gaining economically and
Right.
beneficially from that, the more they would be inclined. And as China itself develops and becomes more economically strong, there will be economic incentive to do it. Still, the big issue, of course, is the freedom of the press, which I think freedom of the press, in my opinion, is the single most important freedom, even more important than one person, one vote, because we can see
Right.
in many countries where you give people a vote and it can be bought or cheated or
Sure.
all different things. So I'm of course a believer in democracy, one person, one vote, but I don't think it's important as freedom of the press. And freedom of the press is not going to happen in China under the current structure at all. You can't have a one party system in freedom of the press. That doesn't compute.